Hi, my name is Erin Kelly, and I will be presenting Chapter 5, which is on Communication Policy and Technology for this class. The first thing to consider when we talk about communication policy and technology is the type of balancing act that actually has to take place regarding this. Because of the First Amendment, which states Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, there is quite a balancing act that has to go on between the policies that are made and staying within the realms of this law. Communication, there are different types of policies and regulations regarding what they're regulating. And for example, the type of regulations that might exist for the telephone would be completely different than the type of regulations that might exist for something, say, like the internet. Another thing to consider is the very important Telecommunications Act of 1996. And this actually changed media ownership limits for national and local market power to radio, TV, and cable industries. And the Federal Communications Commission, or otherwise known as the FCC, it was given authority to review and revise these rules as necessary. And then the last thing to look at is the fact that international and national interests regarding regulations are considered very important. For example, something like the satellites. This affects both national and international countries, so regulations regarding satellite transmissions have to be taken into consideration. The first thing to look at in the policies that are made are the 5 different types of medias that are used, and that is the telegraph, telephone, broadcasting, internet, and cable television. And the first one to look that the textbook actually looks at is the telegraph. And many U.S. communication policies were established early in history regarding the telegraph. And there's actually a great debate that went on as to whether it should be viewed as a national extension of the post office or if it should have a government ownership more like the European countries actually had. And the second type of thing that we're going to look at today is the telephone. And the telephone is the diffusion of the phone was slowed by competing unconnected companies who were actually just trying to serve their own interests. And then AT&T actually dominated most of the urban markets. And as the phone spread in the 1900s, states and municipalities began regulating and licensing operators as public utilities, although Congress actually authorized Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, to regulate phone services in 1910. It never became a major player in the communication policies. And then for telephones, some of the policies that were created was the Transportation Act of 1920, and this was the act which created common carriage laws which required carriers to serve their customers without any discrimination and to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. And serving the public interest, convenience, and necessity is actually still something that is used by the FCC today. There's also the 1907 AT&T, the AT&T president created a slogan which says, "One system, one policy, universal service." And this became a reality when AT&T was given the monopoly power under strict regulations to create the much needed unity within the telephone industry. The next one to look at is broadcasting, and this was developed to serve local markets. The Federal Radio Act imposed technical regulations on all use of spectrum and power, allowing stations to develop a stable local presence in 1927. And then the Communication Act of 1934 combined regulations of telecom and broadcasting by instituting a Federal Communications Commission, and this was that they were to serve the public interest. And that's something that's very important to note, that they were there to simply serve public interest. And also, the One of the most controversial regulations that was created for broadcasting was known as the Fairness Doctrine, which was established in 1949. And this required broadcasters to present varying viewpoints on issues of public importance. This actually was reversed in 1985 because the FCC thought that it was no longer necessary to have each radio station show contrasting viewpoints because there was enough competition out there where enough viewpoints were getting out to the public. The next thing that we're going to look at is cable TV, and this began as a technology to transmit distant broadcast signals to rural areas. The early system sought permission from local authorities, and then eventually Congress made cable companies pay royalty fees to broadcasters. And then the Cable Communications Act of 1984 was passed to formalize the municipal franchising process while limiting some of their rate regulations authority. And this act was actually passed, as you can see from the table here on the slide. Cable companies began to grow exponentially within the first few years that they became popular, and because of this, the amount of money that they were able to charge was quite large. As you can see, in 1960 there were only 650,000 users, but by 1978 that number had increased dramatically. So this act was actually, cable rates were increased, and this created Cable Television Consumer Protection and Competition Act of 1992, just because the rates kept going up and up and up, and there had to be some sort of regulation to protect consumers. And then the last thing that we're gonna talk about is the internet. In 1996, the internet was a growing phenomenon, and the biggest regulation concern regarding this was just all the adult content that was now available out there. And actually, Congress passed a Communications Decency Act to regulate the kind of content that could go on the internet, but the Supreme Court actually struck down that act on grounds that it violated the First Amendment. The internet actually does not fall under any traditional regulatory regime, and it's considered information service, and so it's not subject to any type of regulation for the most part. Now we're going to look at just some of the recent developments that are taking place within the policies and regulations of technologies. First one is network neutrality, and the FCC does not have authority to regulate an internet service provider's network practices. And then the second one is media ownership, and this is where actually the FCC tried to open it up more, and it was actually rejected, but that might be possibly changing in the future. And lastly is broadband. National Broadband Plan was actually a part of the recent America Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, and the U.S. is doing pretty well in their broadband advancement. They rank 15th among developed nations for broadband penetration, and they also have a very detailed plan about how they're going about implementing their broadband plan. And some of the strategies just include design policies to ensure a robust competition. Second, to ensure efficient allocation and use of government-owned and government-influenced assets. And they also want to reform current universal service mechanisms to support deployment of broadband. And then lastly, just to reform laws, policies, standards, and incentives to maximize benefits of broadband for government priorities such as the public education or healthcare system. And the government also actually created just a whole list of goals that they want to try and complete, which the goals can be found in our textbook. And these goals are, they're trying to reach them by the year 2020. There actually are, I have a few graphs on the slides just showing just where some of the other countries are regarding the broadband penetration, and this first one is the international broadband penetration, and it's just showing how the different countries other than the US are ranking as far as broadband, both mobile and fixed broadband. And then the second graph is just showing the growth of broadband, and as you can see from this graph, broadband is actually growing quite rapidly at this point, and the United States is actually doing quite well compared with a lot of countries. Them, Canada, some of the European countries are doing quite well and ranking rather high in broadband growth and penetration. And the last thing to consider regarding Chapter 5 for this week are factors to watch for in the future of policies for communication technologies. The first factor to watch for is that the Communications Act is actually probably going to be revisited, and some things are probably going to be revised. Secondly, with the limited authority of regulations and broadband service, that probably is also going to be changing in the near future, and it's something just that people should keep their eye on. And then lastly, policymakers must continue to explore ways to serve the public interest. And this is something that's very important and has to always be considered when we talk about any policies that are being made as far as communication technologies. Any policies that are going to be made have to make sure that they are there to serve the public interest. And so with all of this information about new policies and such concerning communication technologies, the question that I have come up with for the class is, do you feel that more regulations in areas such as broadband are necessary, or do you see it as an infringement upon the First Amendment? So I look forward to reading all about your answer to this question and just your thoughts on Chapter 5, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you.